So I was on Instagram the other day and I saw in the stories section, I'll just show you and then I'll talk about it. It's just about 30 seconds long. So when I saw this, it made me incredibly sad for a few reasons. One is that obviously that woman was either didn't know that this little calf had her mother taken from her, because that's what happens to calves in the dairy industry, and that was a little baby calf, and that calf is in some sort of petting zoo, but that calf, he or she was removed from her mother. And that's something that happens all the time in the dairy industry. The male calves are often just taken off to slaughter, and they're even sucking on the fingers of slaughterhouse workers as they're being dragged across the slaughterhouse floor. And female calves are just enslaved like their mother. You know, here's this little baby who's been separated from her mother, or his mother, and is desperate to find a teat to suck on, because all this little baby gets is bottled artificial supplements from the petting zoo where it looks like this little one was. In the case of in the dairy industry, if they're wanting to keep the female calves and they don't end up like the male calves in the slaughterhouse, and these are male calves that are like a few days old, if they don't end up like that, or then they are given artificial milk to replace the milk that we end up having on our tables. Well, I don't end up having it on my table because I'm vegan, but most people still are drinking the milk of another species, which is something that all other species pretty much don't do. We're the only species that actually drinks the milk of another, that's meant for the babies of another species. So that little baby, just like all the other babies in the dairy industry, all the other baby calves, has their milk removed from them to be sold to humans. And then the ones that are not killed and end up in the veal industry, because the veal industry is closely associated with the dairy industry, if they don't end up there, then they end up drinking artificial milk via a bottle. So this poor little baby is just looks like teats of his or her mother, and is trying to suck on them. And I find that tragic, and I know it goes on every day, what's happening to mothers and their children in the dairy industry. And this woman, either she probably doesn't know and doesn't think about it and just finds it amusing. I mean, it's kind of perverse, really, somebody dressing up as a dairy cow and then coming up to a baby calf. I liken it to, say, someone going into an orphanage and pretending that they are the mother of some child, sort of just for a joke, coming up to a child and saying, I'm your mother, and then laughing in their face when they sort of look all sort of astonished and whatever. It's kind of a bit like that. The only difference is, of course, that orphans don't get slaughtered. Or orphans aren't, in this day and age, they're not used as property and sent into slavery. There are children that are enslaved in some countries as part of the nightmare that is capitalism. But I mean, on the whole, children aren't used that way. And certainly their mothers are then not forced to breed into existence many other children to be enslaved either. There's many, many things I could say about the dairy industry, but I will leave a link to a blog post called What is Wrong with Vegetarianism? And that explains it very clearly, what happens in the quote-unquote organic milk industry, where people think that's some kind of good dairy, where animals are treated, in quotes, humanely. But as I mention on this site regularly, it doesn't matter if they're sung to sleep at night time and got separate beds, and people stroke their heads before they kill them. It's all the animal use is abusive. There's no such thing as non-abusive use of animals, and all of this organic stuff is just to sell expensive animal products and to soothe the consciences of the public who is not vegan. But that's not really why anyway, I'll leave that blog post in the information section. And if you are not vegan, or if you are vegetarian and you think to yourself, no, I don't really want to know about this, because this will make it very difficult for me to continue consuming animal products. This leads me to my next bit, which is about a video I saw today from Philosophy Tube with Abigail Thorne, and she was talking about how there's a word, and it's escaped my mind, it's terrible, I should have written it down. There's a word for when people don't want to know something, they want to keep ignorant, because if they find out about an issue, it will make it difficult for them to continue on doing whatever it is that they've found out further information about. For example, if somebody is eating a certain kind of chocolate, a certain brand, and they've heard around the place that child labor is used for that brand, they may not want to go further into it, or they may be sorry that they heard that because they want to continue eating that particular brand of chocolate. Of course, chocolate has got dairy in it, so if people knew what went on in the dairy industry as a normal, everyday thing, they probably would not want to eat chocolate either. So there's, a few things going on there. And so I'm going to show you this little clip of what Abigail Thorne says about this kind of ignorance, and then I'll just talk a little bit more about it, then I'll wrap it up.
It's just some things that I don't need to know. Active ignorance is when you go out of your way to make sure that you don't know something, to ignore it, because you need to not know. And that's where things get interesting. For instance, I am not, at time of recording, a vegetarian. Maybe I will be someday. I have tried a few times, and if I'm honest, it made me pretty miserable. But I am aware, because I have vegetarian and vegan friends, that if I were to really look into what factory farming is like, it's possible that would make me even more miserable than not eating meat would. And so, I don't look into it. In order to avoid being miserable, I deliberately remain ignorant. And most of the time, I don't even think about that ignorance. I'm deliberately ignorant of my deliberate ignorance. This is an example of what philosopher Jennifer Foster calls doxastic anxiety. That's anxiety about forming beliefs. I don't want to believe that eating meat is wrong, so I remain deliberately ignorant of anything that might change my mind. There's a subtle point here, which you might disagree with, which is that believing or not believing something can be a moral matter. In other words, morality isn't just about your actions, eating meat or not. There are moral ways to think as well. If I get to heaven someday, and my old philosophy teacher's there, and he says, "So, how do you think that went?" I'll have to say, "Well, Mr. Baker, I don't think I tried my best. When it came to the question of whether or not it's right to eat meat, I dodged the question." Is that, on its own, grounds for not getting into heaven? Is there a certain point at which denial itself becomes morally wrong?
So I'm sure that there's possibly even people watching this right now, if you haven't already turned off because you don't want to think about this. That's another thing that happens. People go, "Oh, no, this is a vegan video. I thought this was going to be all about anti-imperialism. I don't want to hear about this. It's got nothing to do with me. It's got nothing to do with imperialism." That's wrong, but we'll talk about that another time, or maybe I'll just bring it all together at the end. But you may have, and there are people who just unsubscribe because it causes so much cognitive dissonance, and also they don't want to know about, they think that they're going to hear stuff that's going to make it difficult for them to continue on eating animal products. And by the way, I just want to stress that veganism is not the same as vegetarianism, and because veganism is a rejection of using animals for food, clothing, entertainment, and other reasons. So it's not the same as vegetarianism, and unfortunately, it's conflated a lot. And some of those animal organizations have contributed to that confusion because they make out like veganism and vegetarianism are the same, or that you can start with vegetarianism and maybe 20 years down the track get to veganism. I'm not about baby steps here, because when you know something's wrong, then you stop doing it, hopefully. When I heard about the dairy industry, I don't know what it took me so long. I don't even know why I didn't question, where's all this milk coming from? Like this milk is actually meant for baby calves. Why on earth are we eating it? You just take for granted a lot of things about animal use because you're born into a society which is deeply speciesist and has indoctrinated us to believe that animals are here for us to use. When I actually saw a piece that was written about the dairy industry and what went on, this isn't in great detail either, not like this What's Wrong with Vegetarianism link that I'm going to provide you with by UVE Archives. When I just read a bit of it, I thought, I just was so shocked that it was possible to actually get away with that and for it to be completely legal. Now that's funny, isn't it? Because like I knew that killing was wrong, so why was I a non-vegan, right? I knew killing was wrong, and yet I was still, I went through times where I was vegetarian in my life, but there was still a tremendous amount of violence still, even in all the other industries, the dairy industry, the egg industry, and all of that. Anyway, finally, when I looked at that piece, I just decided to go vegan overnight with my partner. We both talked about it and then went vegan overnight. This is about 16 years ago, and I've never looked back. It's like the only regret I have is that I didn't become vegan sooner. But if you haven't already unsubscribed from the channel, or you haven't sort of thought, I don't want to know about this, then that's great that you have not done that. What I want people to know from this in particular is that there's a vegan inside all of us, because we know that harming animals is wrong. We know that abusing them is wrong. We will step in if somebody is attacking, say, a kitten or a puppy, or even if it's a quote-unquote farm animal. If somebody is in front of us doing something really cruel, most of us, unless we're a little bit psychopathic, most of us know that animals morally matter. We know in our hearts that they are like us in some ways, that they are sentient. They may not look the same as us. They may not show the same emotions. They may not communicate like us. They may not drive cars and all of that, but we know that they're sentient. We know they're sentient. And so we recognize that sentience, and we recognize that they are the wonderful beings that they are. And there's no difference really in sentience between a cat or dog whom we love, whom we consider family members in quotes, and the pig and sheep and hen and all of that, all those different other species that we use for food. And there's 1 to 3 trillion land and aquatic animals are killed for trivial reasons and mostly palate pleasure, because we don't need animal products at all to survive. We can easily meet all our nutrition requirements from plants and other non-animal sources. So the only reason we're putting these animals through tremendous suffering and torture is because we think they taste good, even though we don't need to use them at all. And that includes the dairy industry. We don't need to use dairy products. We don't need to use leather. We don't need to use fur or wool. We don't need to use animals at all. We do because we can. And that's a human supremacist attitude. And I've often likened what we're doing to animals, and we get away with, the same as what is being done all over the world, the intentional ignorance or the plain ignorance about the Palestinian situation. They're a very vulnerable group, probably one of the most oppressed groups on the planet today, and we have the complicity of different the corporate media and governments, because there is something to be gained from keeping the public in an ignorance about that issue, because the whole apartheid Israel situation is closely connected with US imperialism. It's a symbiotic relationship. So the public a lot of people are starting to wake up now. And that group, if we sort of think to ourselves, well, I don't care about Palestinians, it has nothing to do with me, I don't have nothing to gain from speaking out about that issue, what does that say about us when they're the most oppressed and vulnerable human group on the planet? And that's where I liken the oppression of a vulnerable group of humans to the most vulnerable group on the planet, even more vulnerable than Palestinians, who are non-human, another species, and we oppress them, we exploit, torture and kill them. We get somebody else to do it for us so we can have these animal products. We do that because we can. And we often, I remember a close family member not wanting to hear about what happens to free-range hens. They didn't want to know, because they wanted to continue eating eggs, and they thought that the whole scam that is free range, it's all industrialized pretty much now, just like this whole factory farming focus that people have. Free range and all of that, organic and all of that, is as dodgy and is as torturous, more torturous. In fact, the dairy industry and the egg industry is pretty awful too. This family member did not want to know, because, as I mentioned, with this certain sort of ignorance where it has a name which I can't remember right now, but you don't want to know the details, because that would mean you might have to change your behavior. So rather than us continue on trying to willfully avoid getting information about what we're participating in, rather than doing our best to try and avoid that, which causes a lot of discomfort because it keeps cropping up, and it'll keep cropping up more and more as more and more vegans are on the planet. Why don't we just do something about it? Why don't we just stop participating in the tremendous violence? If we say we're for non-violence, if we say we want peace on the planet, then it's a long stretch to think that killing 1 to 3 trillion land and aquatic animals is not tremendous violence and something that we should avoid. And we can avoid it really easily. So if we're true to that whole non-violence issue, and if we are against exploiting and oppressing and all of that towards the vulnerable, then we must include non-human animals in that. We must. And another thing that happened to me on Instagram recently, which was truly kind of almost funny toward the end, but Russell Brand posted something about basically, if you want what kind of world you want, you have to start sort of trying to make that change in yourself. He put it in a certain way. I'll see if I can find that and I'll pop it up. And so I said, well, becoming vegan would be a start. Well, did that not unleash a bunch of trolling and what about plants and all these really sad excuses to avoid addressing the real issue, which is that this site that Russell Brand has, he's become quite spiritual, and he does on the side, he does these videos that are spiritual videos, meditation and all of that, and he's become vegan. It took him a while, but fortunately he became vegan. And I feel like that's just somebody once said, the minimum standard of decency, particularly when you are claiming that you want violence to end in the world, and particularly if you say you care about the climate crisis. And that's a whole other thing, and I've done numerous videos on the climate crisis in relation to animal agriculture. But there was literally about 70. It ended up I ended up sort of writing responses to a lot of people, and after a while there was a whole lot of trolley type comments, which I'm fine with sincere comments about veganism, but when people are trying to do little gotcha things or they're putting out nonsense about nutrition and all of that, it gets a bit tiresome. But anyway, there were 70 comments, and I just thought, wow, there's a whole bunch of people that have got cognitive dissonance, because if you didn't really care about the issue, if you didn't care about, if something hadn't struck you in that and made you feel uncomfortable about what you were participating in, you wouldn't be bothered really making a comment. Most people wouldn't be bothered. So there was a whole lot of people on that site of Russell Brand's, who are probably there thinking that they're doing great things, thinking that they're wanting to become more spiritual, more peaceful and all of that, but completely freak out when somebody suggests that we should stop using animals. Isn't it interesting? And I've said this before about particularly those on the left. Like, for example, I was on a live stream the other day and I donated some money, and there were 2 hosts there, and I think they were both vegan. I don't know how clear they are about the whole thing, but as far as I know, one of them was vegan. Aoife's come to join me, and Aoife is a refugee of domestication. So they were. I gave them this money, and then it was a super chat thing, and in the super chat I just mentioned something about veganism, because they'd already been talking about something to do with it and how factory farming is awful, and I've talked about this whole idea of factory farming, that it's actually the whole thing. A lot of it is industrialized now, a lot of it, but factory farming is never going to end. I didn't put that in the super chat because you can only put a small amount of information, but I'm just saying now, factory farming is never going to end while most of the public is not vegan, because all it is doing is meeting demand. It has to be economically viable. That's what these animal agribusiness ventures do. They try and cram as many animals into a space as they can. It's economically efficient. So factory farming, in quotes, is never going to end while the population increases, which it is, and why most people are not vegan. I have to wrestle with Aoife sometimes. So anyway, I said in the super chat, I said, I ended, it was only 2 sentences because that's all you can fit in there. I said, and as a last sentence, and there's no such thing as non-abusive use of animals, because I was addressing this whole "isn't factory farming awful?" as if other forms of animal exploitation that aren't factory, as if other forms of animal exploitation that aren't factory farming aren't awful, and as if other forms of animal exploitation that aren't factory farming doesn't result in children being taken away or some form of abuse and torture, and in the end killing, because that's what. It doesn't matter what industry, if it's organic or whatever, they end up killing non-productive animals. And they still take away the babies and all of that. So anyway, I ended this little super chat with there's no such thing as non-abusive use of animals. And the person who was reading it out, one of the hosts, sort of saw the super chat and sort of just said, thanks, Faint Signals from Vega, for your super chat. But they'd been reading out all the other super chats of everybody else, no matter how kind of inane some of them might have been, but didn't read out mine. Now, why would that be? Well, that's a good question. I can guess and think that maybe that particular host thinks that animals that aren't exploited outside of the factory farming, that's good. You know, that if people go and buy meat from ethically sourced, in quotes, or humane animal products, in quotes, then that's better than nothing. It's not better than nothing, particularly for those animals that are being used that way. Like I said in the beginning, if we know something is wrong, then we need to avoid it and do something that isn't going to end up resulting in the torture and killing of animals. So, you know, when we know that racism is wrong, we do our best to avoid engaging in racism, and we look at ourselves internally and we try and address that every day. If you're white people or whatever, and you're brought up in a privileged white supremacist sort of a society, which in many ways it is in these Western countries, then you have to work on these things because you've been indoctrinated in subtle ways and in obvious ways. So back to that, the host of that program, I don't know whether they were afraid that if they said something like this, there's the other thing of being afraid to mention that from their side, because they think that maybe people won't give them so much money, that it will alienate people that are not vegan. There's that too. And I've said that the left, this is the last bastion of something that the left needs to get a hold of. It really is. I have to be honest with you and say that when I see so many people wringing their hands about the violence against Palestinians and how awful that is, and yes, it's absolutely appalling, and I've done many videos on that, I sometimes think to myself, if only you really were confronted with what we're really doing to non-human animals every single day. Every second of every day, thousands of non-human animals are being tortured and killed. Right now, during this video, every second. And why is that separate from what we're doing, what the world is doing to Palestinians? Trying to make excuses to keep all that going, because who cares about the Palestinians, right? And there's things to be gained, so who cares if there's 66 children killed recently? Who cares if there was 550 Palestinian children killed in 2014? Who cares if every day Palestinians are gunned down in the street, executed, like they're animals, in quotes? You often hear that, right? They treated them like they were animals, like they had no value. That's exactly right. That's exactly how Palestinians are viewed by the state, by the Israeli government, by a lot of people, a lot of Israelis who've been indoctrinated to believe that Arabs are like vermin, in quotes. What does that remind you of? So when you're indoctrinated to believe a group is lesser like that, anything can happen. But that's exactly the same kind of attitude we have towards non-human animals. That they're lesser than us, that they're of some use to us, whether it's as some kind of companion, in quotes, or they're used for wool or leather, and those animals are killed too, or they're used for dairy or whatever. This is exactly the same kind of attitude. This is exactly the same kind of attitude that the Israeli government have towards Palestinians. Not that they use them for food or anything, but they see them as lesser, as a thing, as something that is even lesser than an animal, probably even, something to be eradicated, like a pest. That's how a lot of the Israeli government see Palestinians. That's how a certain majority of the public see Palestinians. Just watch what Abby Martin, when she was interviewing people in Tolerance Square, which is the irony of that. You've probably seen that video. People talking about Arabs like they're nothing, something to have a bomb dropped on them or kick them out or whatever. These attitudes are completely aligned and connected. The attitude we have towards non-human animals. And when I go back to, and the attitude we have towards Palestinians, some in the apartheid, oh Jesus, and some have in the apartheid state of Israel. They're completely connected, and that's why I draw connections with these different forms of discrimination. And that's why I draw connections with these different forms of discrimination, because they're all faces of the same ignorance. They're all faces of the same ignorance. They all cause violence. And where you have one form, you will have all forms. Where we have one form of discrimination, we'll have all forms of discrimination. Where we have one, we'll have all forms. That's basically how it works. Because if we can devalue and otherize the Palestinians, if we can devalue and otherize black people, and basically see them as lesser, you can do anything to them. And that's intentional. And look what we're doing to non-human animals. We've been indoctrinated to believe they're lesser simply because they're another species. Well, species is an irrelevant criterion. If we find ourselves, when somebody tries to let us know about what's happening in, say, the dairy industry or the egg industry, they throw little male chicks alive into a grinder. That's normal. By the hundreds every day. I mean, there's literally probably hundreds of millions of male chicks are thrown into grinders alive every year. And not all of them are killed instantly, so they're all maimed. You know, there's all these kind of things going on, but it doesn't matter. In the end, it's that we use them. That's what the issue is. It's not about how we use them, it's that we use them at all. So if we're afraid about hearing about this, then we need to examine, and really think about, do we really want to continue on going la 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 la? Do we really want to continue on over and over and over again, trying to avoid the truth and trying to acknowledge what we're participating in? Because without us consuming animal products, that's meat, dairy, eggs, fish, etc. Yes, fish is sentient. Without our consumption of that and our demand for that, all this violence wouldn't be happening. So it starts with you and me. And I welcome anybody who's interested in becoming vegan to please contact me. You can leave a comment in the community section of YouTube, or you can leave a comment in this comment section, and I'd be happy to try and give advice. And you can also check out my vegan resource, howtogovegan.org. In the end, the willful ignorance, the kind of I don't want to know because that'll mean I'll have to change how I'm living. It's really not that hard to be vegan at all. It's not hard at all. And one day, in a very, very short time, you'll be thinking, wow, I'm so grateful that I became vegan, because it really is, over time, it has an amazing effect on your mind and your attitudes to life. It really does. It's a lot more profound than what people think it is, from the outside. And it's a really, really life-changing in a good way sort of thing. So let's stop trying to avoid hearing what's going on in these industries. And even if we hear about it and we think, well, all they need to do is be treated humanely and then everything will be fine, that's not the way to go either. It's about us using them, period, that is wrong.